Hey everybody, today our passage is Isaiah chapters 13 and 14. If you have been reading along on Fridays through Isaiah, you'll notice that there's a shift in who Isaiah is talking to. Up until this point, the message of Isaiah, the prophet, has been primarily speaking to the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember, we've talked about how the history of how the people came into the land and were united under Saul, David, and Solomon, but then there was a civil war and the two nations split to the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. And so Isaiah is operating in the sort of the final days while Israel is still kind of existing as a nation state. And Isaiah is directing his prophecy to these people who are still God's people, who have basically turned away from worshiping Yahweh. They've worshipped other gods, and they've mistreated one another. And there's just a lot of corruption and evil and injustice that has been running rampant in Israel. And so the bulk of Isaiah's prophecy has been to these people, saying, God is trying to get your attention. Don't you know that you're doing the wrong thing? And turn back to God before it's too late. Otherwise, these things are going to happen to you. We already talked about how that's called forthtelling rather than foretelling, that people have a chance to hear and respond and turn. Otherwise, if they don't, well, these things will happen to you. Sort of the natural consequence of your actions are going to take place. So what is the natural consequence of their actions? Well, up until this point, God was going to bring in these foreign nations, these superpowers, to come in and basically remove Israel off the map. That people were going to be sent away into exile and their land taken away from them. And God is going to use these foreign nations. And at the time, this is one of the biggest sort of political and geographical crises that was happening. That as Judah and Israel had split from each other and were no longer a sort of superpower themselves, all around them, these other nations had been gaining power. Egypt and Moab and the Philistines, Assyria and Edom and Babylon. And Persia, all these nations sort of all surrounding Israel had sort of grown in strength. And God was going to use them to come and basically teach the people of Israel a lesson. But as we're reading in chapter 13, you'll have noticed that the tone has shifted from talking about the people of Israel and them facing God's judgment and God wanting to get their attention, to now all of the other nations the prophet has turned his attention to. Isaiah starts to talk about Babylon in these two chapters, but he also has things to say about the Philistines, about Egypt, about Ethiopia, or Cush, as the Bible puts it, about Moab, about Assyria, and he's directing these sort of prophecies or these warnings to these people as well. And what's the point of this? Well, at the time, during this time, people thought that whatever nation you lived in, well, you had a patron god, your sort of key god that was in control of that nation. But other gods of other nations, they had no influence over your land unless that god sort of overpowered your god. And then it was thought that they would come in and destroy your land, and their god would be proclaimed as the god of that nation and your nation, because, well, that god is stronger than yours. And so what God is doing, what the prophet Isaiah is doing here, is letting the people know that even though God is allowing these foreign nations to come and sort of be his instruments of warning and judgment to God's people, that it's not as if those gods have won, that they are stronger than Yahweh. In fact, as we'll see, between chapters 13 and 23 of Isaiah, the exact opposite is the case. That God is judging these other nations who have confidence in themselves and their own gods, that God is actually saying, I am in charge of the whole world, of every nation, of every people, that I am God over everything and everyone, and that these other little gods that you worship and trust in, they have no power. They're not real. And so the same sort of standard that I'm judging my own people in Israel with, I'm actually going to be expecting of every other nation, the whole world. And that if you don't measure up, if you're not following the way of Yahweh, you're not treating each other with kindness and justice and mercy and respect, well then, the same fate is going to happen to you. So in chapters 13 and 14, Isaiah turns his attention to the kingdom of Babylon, which at this point is a growing superpower. They're not the superpower yet, but they soon are going to be, as we'll explore in future weeks. And so God is saying, even though you are growing and you think you are strong and you're mighty, actually you're going to see that if you don't follow the ways of the Lord as well, Babylon's going to be wiped off the map too. And we know, historically, that's exactly what happened. There's no Babylon anymore. There's no Persia anymore. There's no Moab anymore. These nations that existed don't anymore. But as you'll notice, there are often these lines of that's not the end of the story, though. That though the whole world is going out of control and God has a word of judgment for the whole world, in that if you are abusing the way that God designed you, well, that's bad news. However, you may notice there's these sentences that get dropped in where God says, but that's not the end of the story. There is still hope. That if you turn and trust in the Lord, you start acting the way that He has called you to live, well, there will be a people, a remnant that continues to live, to thrive, to be okay, and one day they will experience the goodness of God. If you fast forward this is exactly what the book of Revelation is talking about. That on the final day, when the day of the Lord finally comes and God judges every individual heart and all the nations as well, that there will be people who find themselves on the wrong side of God's judgment and justice because they've disobeyed and they've turned away from God. But then those who have remained true and faithful will experience the blessing of God and be welcomed into His kingdom. And that the final picture is that people from every tribe, tongue, nation, people, and language are going to be gathered around the throne, worshiping and praising Jesus. So, as we read through these prophecies of judgment and condemnation, we are to know that we shouldn't just be bogged down by the negativity, but that God is actually wanting to restore people. God wants people to know Him. And He promises that those who remain true to His ways and trust in Him rather than other gods or other nations or other things, they will be seen through. They'll be welcomed into His kingdom too. More on this in later week, but that's all I'll leave you with today, and we'll see you around next week. Bye.